Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to go over functional groups, and these are groups that will be attached to a molecule or organic compound, and all of these different groups have a name associated with them so that we can identify what type of group it is. So for now, I'm only going to expect you to know the first two rows of names, but we'll still go over the last row as well, just to give you an overview. The last row will come up later on in chemistry or in organic chemistry, so don't worry too much about them for now. Okay, so let's go over the first two rows. Now, the first row, you'll notice we only have carbons and hydrogens in each of these different groups. So we call this first row the hydrocarbon functional groups. And I'm going to abbreviate functional groups as FG. So we have alkanes. Alkanes have carbons and hydrogens, and the carbon atoms are all singly bonded to each other. And then next to that, we have alkenes, and alkenes also have carbons and hydrogens, but you will see a double bond between one or two of the carbons there. And then next to that, we have alkynes. Alkynes will have a triple bond. And then finally, we have the benzene ring, also called a phenyl group. Now, you'll notice that on each of these different groups, there's a bond that's kind of sticking out with nothing attached to it. So we're assuming that we have some sort of molecule. Just pretend this is, a molecule over here. And then we have a group kind of coming off of that. So maybe this is our alkane group. So this would actually be our group that's coming off of a molecule. So the way that we represent the molecule is with a letter R. I guess that doesn't really show up, so I'll put R down below. So on each of these, we can put an R wherever this group connects to the molecule. All right, so now the second row. The second row, you'll notice, contains atoms other than carbon and hydrogen. So we see some nitrogen, some oxygen, we see the halogens, and sulfur. So we call this row the heteroatom functional groups. So heteroatom just means we have different types of atoms. All right, so let's start with the amine group. So the amine group has a nitrogen with a lone pair, and it's bonded to either two hydrogens, a hydrogen and some other group, which is represented by R, or two R groups. So I'll draw that up above, just to kind of give you an idea of what that might look like. So if we have nitrogen coming off of some molecule. It could either be attached to two hydrogens, and that would be called actually a primary amine. And we would give that an abbreviation of 1 with a degree symbol next to it. Or one of those hydrogens might be some other group. And we can just represent that other group with an R. And that would be a secondary amine. Or we could have two R groups. So that would be called a tertiary amine. And we'll talk more about amines later on, but amines are really smelly. I used to have to work with amines when I was doing research, and I had to be in a separate room, and I would go home smelling like rotting fish. It was horrible. Luckily, I lived alone at the time, so no one else had to smell it. Now, again, this nitrogen will be bonded to some R group, some R molecule. All right, the next group is the alcohol group. And alcohols are things like methanol, ethanol, propanol. So you might have maybe used these types of molecules before. And again, there's an R group there. Next is an ether. So in an ether, we have an oxygen that's bonded to some other group. So I'm actually going to put R's on either side there. Ethers were, or actually ether was used as anesthetic in dentistry in the early days of dentistry. They don't use it anymore though. Alkyl halides, this is our next set of functional groups. So sometimes we'll represent alkyl halides as Rx. So the R represents, some group or molecule, and then X represents a halogen. So if you have a halogen bonded to some group with carbons and hydrogens in it, for instance, we would call this an alkyl halide. The next one is a thiol group. So thiol indicates that we have a sulfur and a hydrogen. So this is very similar to the alcohol group we saw earlier, except instead of oxygen, we have sulfur. Next to that, we have a sulfide group, and this is similar to the ether group. So sometimes it's also called a thioether. And last but not least, we have the disulfides. So in a disulfide group, you have two sulfurs bonded together. And if you've taken biology before, you might already know that these are present in proteins. And disulfide bonds are what help proteins fold and form their shapes. Or they're one of many types of bonds, but that's one of the important ones in proteins. All right, so that really covers the first few functional groups, and I would like you to memorize these different groups and their names. So just those first two rows. And just really quickly, I want to go over the third row just so you're kind of aware of these types of functional groups, but you don't have to memorize them quite yet. So the last row we refer to as carbonyl functional groups. And in each of these functional groups, we have a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. And then it's, attached to other atoms as well. So we have, for instance, aldehydes, which have a central carbon again that has a double bond to an oxygen. And then it's bonded to some other, set of atoms. And the key part here is we have a hydrogen bonded to that carbon. And then ketones are very similar, except we have, two other groups bonded to that central carbon. And aldehydes and ketones smell really sweet typically. In fact, they're often used in beverages because they can also taste sweet as well. Next to that, we have the Ester Carbonyl. So our central carbon here will have a double bond to one oxygen, a single bond to another oxygen, and then it's also attached to some other group. And then the oxygen that's singly bonded to that central carbon will be attached to some other group as well. All right, and then after that we have carboxylic acid. So the central carbon, again, is bonded to two oxygens, and then some R group there. But instead of the oxygen that's singly bonded being bonded to some other group, it has a hydrogen attached. So it's almost like an alcohol in that sense, but because that central carbon is also doubly bonded to another oxygen, we call this a carboxylic acid. And then finally, we have an amide group. So again, that central carbon bonded to some R group, it has a double bond to an oxygen, and then it's bonded to a nitrogen, and that nitrogen could be bonded to two hydrogens, a hydrogen and some other group, or two other groups, similar to the amines we talked about before. Okay, so to help you memorize these different names, I just want to pull up our Canvas website. So this is through the Canvas app. And feel free to download the Canvas app. Sometimes it's easier to access things through your phone, because if you're on the go, you can just quickly look it up. All right, so let's look at modules. And under study guides, I will post these functional group flashcards. So this is a separate link. So we're going to open this in Safari. And this is going to provide flashcards to help you remember each of the functional group names. So for instance, this first one has RX, where X is either fluorine, chlorine, bromine, or iodine. So if we click it, it tells us the name, alkyl halide. So you can quiz yourself. You can say, okay, what's the name of this functional group? I see that there's some halogens. It must be an alkyl halide. And then you can see if you got it right. And then we have alkene. So you can try to think of what an alkene looks like. So we have two carbons double bonded to each other, etc. So you can keep going. Now, if you do get to the the carbonyl functional groups, you can skip those for now, but later on you will have to memorize those as well. So if you're willing to memorize them now, it will save you some time later on. Okay, let's go back to our PowerPoint. So that's all we're going to cover in this video. But now you have all the information you need to work on Pod 5. So the file is on Canvas under modules, or you can use the link on the home page. And this pod is about functional groups specifically. So now you have everything you need to finish it. And this isn't due until Sunday, October 4th, so you have some time. All right, I will see you in the next video.